Welcome to Within the Frame, where we bring today's most pressing issues across the globe. I'm Kim Mok-yeon. After 2 weeks of intense negotiations, delegates at COP29, the UN Climate Summit in Baku, reached a historic agreement on Saturday to provide funding for developing countries to combat and adapt to climate change. The deal includes a commitment from wealthy emitters to provide $300 billion annually by 2035, though this falls short of developing nations' expectations. The broader goal of raising $1.3 trillion in climate finance each year by 2035, encompassing both public and private sources, has been hailed as a crucial step towards addressing global warming. But critics say it's a far from perfect arrangement, stressing its limitations. To delve deeper into the outcomes of COP29, we invite to the studio David Kang, head of Japan and Korea research at Bloomberg NEF. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
And we're also joined by David Jones, head of offshore development and country manager at RWE Renewables Korea. Great to have you.
Pleasure to be here.
So let's first start with Mr. Kang. So the COP29 summit on addressing climate change has concluded on November 24th. And could you tell us, what would you say were the biggest takeaways from the summit?
So the main focus of this year's COP29 in Baku was finance. As you mentioned, wealthy nations have agreed to provide at least $300 billion in climate financing annually by 2035, which is actually 3 times higher than the previous target. They've also agreed to work towards a goal of $1.3 trillion a year, although they are betting on most of that to come from the private sector. Another big win this year was agreement on global carbon trading mechanism, also known as Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. And it basically allows countries to trade carbon credits with each other, as well as companies. And this year there was a big progress made on the accounting system for when a country sells a carbon credit, it gets deducted from its own national carbon ledger so that the same credit doesn't get counted twice. And that's an achievement of almost a decade of negotiation. But one big failure from this year's COP was that there was no reiteration of the groundbreaking pledge from the previous COP28 to transition away from fossil fuels. If we think about what the value of COP deal really is, it's all about signaling to the global society the direction of travel of major governments around the world. And failing to repeat what was already approved last year does not send a very positive message.
Right, so there was a need to kind of reiterate what has been approved in the past summit. Mm-hmm.
Yes, exactly.
Now, so you mentioned rich countries agreed to raise $300 billion each year to help developing nations on this. Now, how does that compare to actual investments of these countries to the energy sector? And how much investment are we seeing in South Korea?
To put the $300 billion into context, last year we saw around $1.8 trillion invested in the energy transition sectors globally. So this includes investments in renewable energy projects, electric vehicles, hydrogen, carbon capture and storage, et cetera, et cetera. So $300 billion is about 1/6 of the total annual investments that we saw globally last year. Now, if we think about how much capital would be required for the developing countries who will be receiving this $300 billion financing to get on track for a net zero transition, we at BNEF estimate around $6 trillion would need to be invested annually. So that's about 20 times of what's been committed at COP29 and about 5 times of the $1.3 trillion goal, which includes the private sector. Now, if we look at South Korea, we tracked around $25 billion invested in the energy transition last year. But if we want to get on track for net zero, we'll need to see those investments grow by 4 times to around $100 billion annually in the coming decades. So overall, it's definitely very positive to see increased commitment on climate financing, but they'll still need to scale up quite significantly to get on track for net zero.
So we're having a good progress, but more should be done.
Yes.
Now, in this age of climate crisis, carbon neutrality has become the new international order, and countries have set their nationally determined contributions, NDCs, and are working to achieve them. And for South Korea aims to reduce emissions by 40% from 2018 levels by the year 2030. What efforts do you think are necessary to achieve this target?
So when it comes to 2030 NDC, I think the first thing to remember is that we don't have much time left. And there's a strong need to really focus on technologies that are commercially available today and can be delivered before 2030. So these would be technologies like solar, wind, and electric vehicles. If we look at Korea's renewable energy market, we expect to see around 3 gigawatts of new solar and wind projects added this year. But if you want to get on track for net zero, we'll need to see those additions triple to around 9 to 10 gigawatt every year until 2030. If we look at the electric vehicle market, we're seeing around 160,000 units of EVs sold annually in Korea, but we need to see those sales grow by around 6 times to reach about 1 million EVs sold annually by 2030. So it is a challenging task, but I think they're still within the realm of possibility given how quickly these markets have grown over the past years. And I think it's also important to remember that energy transition is a marathon, it's not a sprint. So as we work on the technology deployments for these near-term targets, we also need to lay the groundwork for scaling emerging technologies like hydrogen and CCS, which will be really critical to decarbonize the hard-to-abate sectors like industries in the later years of the energy transition.
Right, and as our Mr. Kang touched upon the wind sector, let's now bring in Mr. Jones into the conversation. So this year's COP29 served as a platform that could ensure wind energy plays a central role in achieving global climate goals. Do you think offshore wind energy holds a unique position in climate and energy strategies?
Yeah, absolutely. I feel that offshore wind really holds a unique strategic position in national energy and climate strategies, and it's been increasingly recognised as a strategic enabler, particularly for global climate targets as well. It was a big topic at COP29, particularly because some of the key focuses were about scalable, sustainable energy solutions. Offshore wind clearly fits that bill, and particularly with the emerging countries and places where they really are trying to accelerate energy transition. Some of the key topics that were discussed, such as international collaboration, technology transfer, financial backing, these are all some of the key pillars of offshore wind. And even in markets that our company has been involved in Asia and in other markets, these are some of the key things that we try and bring to these markets: technology transfer, knowledge sharing, collaborating between different markets to really help accelerate that energy transition, help countries to leverage offshore wind to meet their greenhouse gas emission reductions in line with the Paris Agreement targets.
Right. And to reach carbon neutrality, we touched upon this a while ago, we need to cut down on fossil fuel use, of course, which currently makes up 60% of electricity production worldwide. So shifting to this renewable energy is key in this context. Could offshore wind energy play a particular role in this transition?
Particularly in countries like Korea, where there is, like you mentioned, 60% of energy generation is fossil fuel based at the moment. Technologies like offshore wind offer the opportunity to generate large volumes of sustainable, clean, renewable energy with zero emissions. So as Korea starts to change its energy mix, we already have a target at the moment for net zero by 2050 and also for coal phase out within that same time period. Offshore wind has the potential to be able to deliver those large volumes of carbon-free energy generation that are needed in order to hit those targets.
Right. And as for South Korea, the nation's cumulative offshore wind capacity was only 124.5 megawatts last year. Despite this, what's your assessment of future potential?
Yeah, at the moment, the cumulative capacity is quite low in Korea. However, the government has set some very ambitious targets. By 2030, it wants to hit 14.3 gigawatts. And then by 2036, it wants to hit over 26 gigawatts. And those targets are even poised to potentially even increase over the next couple of years as new targets are set. So while the market is at the beginning, it really does have huge potential. There seems to be bipartisan support at the moment across Congress, particularly to progress some key pieces of legislation that are needed to accelerate offshore wind. And Korea is also in a very unique position with one of the most capable and innovative supply chains in Asia, already exporting many key products to the global offshore wind industry and able to help the growth of the industry here in this country.
So you're positive about the future potential?
Indeed, I think Korea also has some very strong market fundamentals. You know, the need for the economy to decarbonize, particularly with its export-orientated economy. Almost 40% of GDP is export dependent, and a lot of the countries that are receiving these goods from Korea are really becoming sensitive to the amount of carbon that is used in producing these goods.
Right, so let's look forward to that. And now, Mr. Kang, one of the biggest challenges in expanding renewable energy is high costs, of course. High costs of solar wind projects and compared to fossil fuel-based generation. Now, why is renewable energy so expensive here in South Korea, and what can we do to reduce its costs?
That's a very important question. So if you look at globally, countries where renewable energy is already cheaper than fossil fuel, they account for about 60% of the global electricity market. So in majority of the markets around the world, renewable energy is already cheaper than fossil fuel. And the reason it's so expensive in Korea is a combination of small project scale and regulation, among other things. If you look at the average size of solar projects in Korea, they're about 1 megawatt or smaller. That average size in other markets would be between 10 to 50 megawatts. So that's a 10 to 50 times difference in economies of scale. And the reason these projects are so small is because it's very difficult to find large scale of land to install solar and onshore wind projects because of very strict land regulation. So many municipal governments require solar or wind projects to be located far away from public roads and like residential areas, which really reduces the available land for renewable energy projects. And this also means that the small percentage of land that do meet this requirement command a very high price premium in the market. So if you look at the cost of land for solar or onshore wind projects in Korea, they're actually one of the highest globally. So I think loosening these regulations on land use for renewable energy projects and also organizing more government-led auctions where project sites and also grid connection is guaranteed would really significantly help reduce the cost of renewable energy projects in Korea.
Right. Thank you for the clarification. Now, at the 2024 Asia-Pacific Wind Summit held recently in Songdo, Ben Bagwell, CEO of Global Wind Energy Council, called South Korea the most important ally in the global wind energy sector. Mr. Jones, where is South Korea currently in the energy technology, wind energy technology area?
South Korea has some of the most innovative industry in not only Asia, but globally as well, and it's already playing a significant role in supplying to the global offshore wind supply chain. It's already a key component, whether that be substructures of turbine foundations, whether that be high voltage electrical equipment, wind turbine towers, cables. There are many key parts of infrastructure that are needed that are supplied from Korea. Korea has both the experience, the capability, and also large capacities to produce these large volumes of equipment that are needed. So as we look forward to the different targets across all the many countries that are trying to decarbonize, one thing we recognize from industry is that there is a real supply chain bottleneck. We are facing a problem where the capacity from the supply chain is not big enough to hit the targets globally. So with Korea being such a key industrial center able to produce all of these key components, it's really important that we really find how to grow those opportunities in Korea, to grow the offshore wind market here, but also to see how they can be leveraged to really supply globally.
Right, then with such bright prospects, what role should South Korean government play in developing and growing offshore wind technology, wind energy? Some experts say we need to, improve regulations. And what's your thoughts?
While there's a great technology and supply chain base here, the offshore wind development is very much at a nascent stage. So at the moment, many of the decisions that are made are very regionally distributed. There's not much national coordination. And if a developer wants to build an offshore wind farm, they have to navigate up to 29 different regulations and laws, and it takes between 8 years from finding a site to getting it operational. So the good news is that I think, again, in Congress, there seems to be bipartisan support to make some key changes, to centralise the development of offshore wind farms, to identify sites up front, to coordinate key infrastructure such as ports, grid, to be able to make those accessible and in the right places so that offshore wind can really grow, and really hope that Congress can pass this special bill on offshore wind that they have been discussing for almost 2 years now.
Right, so legislative support is crucial in this subject. Now, South Korea has declared a 2050 carbon neutrality goal, aiming to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions by that year. Mr. Kang, what do you see as key factors that are necessary to meet this target?
So at BNEF, we do a scenario modeling called the New Energy Outlook, looking at how different countries can get to net zero by 2050 from where we are today. And if we look at the results for Korea, clean power, including renewables and nuclear, electrification, and carbon capture and storage. These three areas account for around 70% of the total emissions abatement potential. So I think ramping up investments in these areas would be very crucial. Another important element would be clear and consistent energy policy. So every time Korea has a new government, there's a big swing in technology focus, whether that's renewables, nuclear, CCS, or hydrogen. But the reality is we need all of these technologies if we really want to get to net zero by 2050. And they all require long-term investment that is only possible with clear and consistent energy policy. And last thing, I think there's also a need for a change in mindset as well. Often when we talk about the energy transition in Korea, there's a perception that this is more of a risk and challenge than an opportunity. But if you think about it, the transition would allow Korea to reduce fossil fuel import, increase the energy security, and also presents $2.7 trillion of investment opportunity for Korea, according to our calculations. And globally as well, it would create more demand for technologies like electric vehicles and batteries, which are areas that Korea players are very strong. So I hope we can see more momentum build up in Korea's energy transition so we can capture more of these opportunities before it gets too late.
Right. And to achieve this target that we've mentioned, Mr. Jones, what role can the offshore wind energy play in this context? And what challenges must be addressed for wind energy to become a more sustainable future energy source for South Korea?
Offshore wind has the potential to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by producing carbon-free renewable energy. It also has a lot of opportunities for jobs, economic growth by creating a green economy, really expanding the supply chain that's already here. And it also offers the opportunity for energy independence and security, reducing our dependence on energy imports and price spikes that come with that. In terms of some of the challenges, two of the biggest challenges, of course, are the regulatory challenges that we talked about before, and policy support that's needed, a simplification of the policies to develop offshore wind and a centralisation and strategic approach from government. And then we also need to see key plans in place to support the growth of offshore wind to hit the targets from key infrastructure such as grid rollout, ports and the harbours and other facilities that are needed to really build these mega infrastructure projects.
Right, so let's hope there would be more efforts, private or public, to help these renewable energy sources be more useful in South Korea. I'm afraid we'll have to wrap up our discussion at this point. Mr. Jones and Mr. Kang, thank you so much for your time and your insights tonight.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us on Within the Frame. Be sure to tune in again next time as we continue to explore the stories that matter. Until then, stay informed and engaged.